Hello everyone, it's Rose, and I'm back with Chapter 5 of the Magnate's Manifesto by Jennifer Hayward. Now this is a Harlequin Presents novel that I started reading a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks ago by the time you see this. And I wasn't sure how it would be received, but my viewers are enjoying it, so I'm going to finish the book. And I will be releasing a new chapter every 4 days until I finish chapter 13, which will be sometime in mid-April. Now for the visuals, what you're going to get is me drilling a diamond painting. So I'm not drilling at the same time as I'm reading. Somebody commented, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe you're drilling and reading at the same time." I'm not that coordinated. I'm reading quite separately from the drilling, but it's always nice to have something to watch. And so what you have on the screen is me drilling one of my diamond paintings. I'm going to put the information about that diamond painting also down in the description below, together with information about this book and where to buy it if you want to get it. I also want to mention that up in the top right-hand corner of the screen, if you're new to this series, you will find the playlist for the rest of this book, everything that I've recorded up to this point. And so rather than starting at chapter 5, you might want to go back and start at chapter 1. And I will also include that link at the very end of the video, so that if somebody's coming to this series late, after I've posted all of the chapters, you can just click on that playlist and it'll take you to, you can pick up with chapter 6 after this. Okay? So without any further ado, let's continue with chapter 5 of the Magnate's Manifesto by Jennifer Hayward. Chapter 5. Jared had run the path around the rocky beaches of the Cap for 50 minutes before he gave up trying to figure out what had happened last night and pulled up into a walk, sweat dripping from his chin. Given the lack of information coming from Bailey, the only thing that was clear was that Alexander Gagnon, David's heir apparent and the man who would own the decision as to whether to link Stone Industries and Maison Electronique in a 5-year strategic partnership, knew his CMO intimately enough to call out a mole on her behind. The thought had his already pumping blood charging through his veins. He scowled and wiped his t-shirt over his face. Bailey had said she'd met Gagnon once. He'd propositioned her, and she'd turned him down. So how would he know about the mole? And, he thought, why, in God's name, was that a more pressing question for him than what he was going to do about the changing dynamics of this deal and the impact on his future? He let out a colorful curse and raked his t-shirt over his face again. Why wouldn't Bailey tell him the truth? What could be so horrible about her past that she couldn't tell him? That Alexandra would call her on? He'd seen that look before, the one on Bailey's face last night. It was the exact same one his father had worn when the hounds had closed in, when his inability to escape had become inevitable, when all of his carefully constructed lies had started to unravel. His chest tightened. He did not tolerate secrets. What he should do was march up there and tell Bailey she either came clean or she was out. There was too much riding on this pitch, this deal, not to have complete transparency. But the fact was, she was his ace in the hole. David loved her and her ideas. So eliminating her from the pitch was a non-starter. A massive bird of prey flew in from the sea, its wingspan at least 8 or 9 feet across. His gaze followed it as it arced and headed inland. A vulture? It reminded him of Alexander, the way he tracked Bailey with his eyes last night. It had been beyond the look men had when they coveted something. It had been something else entirely. He turned toward the house, his mouth twisting in a grimace. He'd been right from the beginning. The mystery that was Bailey had a history. a history that could blow the lid off this deal if he didn't find out what it was and defuse it. Now. He made his way up the stairs toward their rooms, refusing to let himself address the other lethal ingredient flavoring the situation, the heat that had exploded between them last night. It was one thing to acknowledge an attraction, another thing entirely to act on it. Because when that cat was out of the bag, it was all too easy to do it again. Out of the question, he thought. He let himself into his room, picked up his cell phone, and dialed the private investigator he used to track his father, just to make sure he was alive every now and again. Danny Garrison picked up after almost 7 rings with a sleepy, "Hello? I need you to dig up everything you can on my CMO, Bailey St. John." There was a rustling sound in the background. "You do realize at some point I do go off the clock." He looked at his watch on the bedside table. 8 a.m. He hadn't even thought about the time difference. "Sorry, but I need this yesterday." "Considering it is yesterday for me, no problem." Sarcasm dripped from his private investigator's voice. "Focus on her time in Vegas. She went to school there." "Am I looking for anything in particular?" Jared stared out at the cerulean blue sky, at the vulture that had looped back over the seashore looking for breakfast. "Something she'd want to hide," he said. Bailey struggled out of an orchid pink silk shirt, her third choice thus far, and tossed it on the bed. Nothing felt right about this presentation happening in 30 minutes. Nothing had since she'd laid eyes on Alexander Gagnon and realized it was him. She snatched the pewter gray version of the same shirt off a hanger and tugged it on. She needed to walk into that room today and nail the presentation. Forget the past and focus on the future. But her churning stomach wasn't cooperating. Her hands fumbled as she pulled the shirt closed and did up the tiny pearl buttons. Would Alexander play nice? And if he didn't, was she now playing Russian roulette with Jared's future? With this deal? Could she afford to do that? Should she just pull herself out now and accept the fact that her past had caught up with her and do the right thing? Her fingers tripped over the buttons, making her curse and focus her concentration. Surely Alexander had better things to do than focus on a bruised ego. He had a major directional partnership to consider for Maison, a company to take the helm of. He would be all business. The knot in her stomach said differently. She thought maybe Jared would fire her first for the inexcusable things she'd said and get it over with. She shoved the last button through the slippery material with a vicious movement. How could she have kissed him? How could she have done that, of all things? She didn't feel lust like that for men, didn't let them close enough to even inspire it because her father had taught her that men were dangerous, unpredictable, better avoided. The arrival of their once-a-month welfare check had sent her father on his infamous benders like clockwork, typically ending with him trashing their house and whichever one of them had particularly annoyed him that day. Her mother had shielded them from him when she could, taking the punishment and sending her girls to the neighbors. But that had only made them feel worse when they'd arrived home the next day to a fresh set of bruises on their mother's face. Add to that her experience as a dancer, and complete abstinence had been her solution. A sharp knock on the connecting door brought her head around. She tucked a stray hair back in her chignon, turned, and walked over to open it. Storm Cloud Jared was in attendance today, his blue eyes crackling with electricity. All business. "You ready?" She nodded. "Let me get my notes." Her prep stuff was in a pile on the desk. She'd left the notes on top, ready to grab, but last night in her agitation, she'd thrown another pile on there, and they didn't seem to be anywhere as she riffled through them, flicking pages upside down. "Bailey." She hadn't realized he'd moved until he was beside her, his hand closing over hers. She looked up at him, teeth tugging at her bottom lip. "They're right here. I just can't—" "Bailey." He took the papers out of her hands and put them down on the desk. "Tell me what's bothering you. Who is Alexander Gagnon to you? We are partners in this. I need to know what's wrong so we can handle it together." She brought her back teeth together before she blew this entirely and pulled her hand free to continue searching for the notes. "He is nothing to me. I told you that." "Then why are you a total disaster?" "I am not a disaster." She rounded on him fiercely, eyes flashing. "This is personal, Jared, and I won't have it brought into this." His mouth twisted. "Were you there last night? Because I was. Alexander is now the deciding voice in this deal. He did not take his eyes off you all night, and then he followed you to the washroom where he was extremely confrontational. So don't tell me it's nothing, Bailey. He is an issue, and I won't have it affecting this deal." She sank her hands into her hips. "Then pull me out." "I can't pull you out. David adores you. He loves your thinking." She pressed her lips together mutinously. She would rather die than tell Jared she'd been a stripper. A man who thought so little of women, he'd written a manifesto about their place being in the bedroom. She could only imagine how derogatory he'd be. It made her stomach curl, as did the thought that he wouldn't want her anywhere near this deal. He let out a muttered oath, his gaze on her face. "Tell me it wasn't something illegal, whatever it is you're hiding." "Illegal?" she thought. She stared at him in disbelief. "What the—" The flare of anxiety in his eyes, the frown furrowing his brow, made it hit home. His father! Of course he would be afraid of scandal. Her stomach lurched dangerously. She wanted to tell him, to reassure him it had everything to do with her, but she could not. She put her hand on his arm, her gaze imploring him. "It's nothing like that. It's a personal matter, Jared, that's all. You need to trust me on this." He stared at her long and hard, as if he wasn't sure what to do with her. Then he let out a long breath. "Okay, this is how we're going to play it. We're going to walk into that room, blow them away with our ideas, and win this contract. You are not going to be distracted. You are not going to address Alexander in any way, shape, or form unless he asks you a question. Play to David, play to the other two, but do not let Alexander shake you." Relief flooded through her. He wasn't going to push her. She could have kissed him, except that had been a bad idea. "Got it," she said firmly. "You can trust me." His gaze singed hers. "Too bad that doesn't go both ways." She shook her head. "It does, I swear it. This is just different." The furrow in his brow deepened. "Someone's done a number on you, Bailey." How about her life, she thought. Did that count? He made a rough sound in his throat. "We have 10 minutes. We should go set up." She nodded and found her notes. If Jared had expected Bailey to be shaky and off her game in the presentation, he was proven wrong. Something switched on in her brain when she walked into that room. Her survival instincts, he figured. She plowed through her slides with a steely determination and enthusiasm that made everyone at the table catch the spirit and engage. He watched that sharp brain of hers ignite, gather momentum as she fed off the feedback she was getting from the table and push her ideas to an even higher creative level. Not once did she look at Alexander, except to answer his pointed and often challenging questions. His own strategies had been solid, but they had been lacking the marketing savvy that Bailey possessed. Together, they made a formidable team. "Don't fight the exodus from retail," she was counseling now, pointing at the screen. "Touch consumers where they work and play. Show them what they're missing in a lifestyle setting like a yoga studio that drives it home for them. Then sell to them on the spot with the kiosks." "Intriguing," Alexander conceded, "if a bit sacrilegious to a retailer like me. You're asking us to focus our marketing budget outside of the stores? Some of it, yes, Bailey said, nodding. It's a reality that people are moving away from brick and mortar retail to the online space. You need to get ahead of the trend now. Alexander got to his feet and started pacing the room, a technique Jared figured he used to intimidate. Yoga is niche, however. How is this really going to impact our bottom line? You replicate it. Bailey flipped to her next slide. You train demo staff, send them not just to yoga studios, but to running centers, health and wellness clinics, gyms. You seed the instructors first, make them fall in love with the product, and then you capture their students. Alexander didn't look convinced. Bailey plunged on, undeterred. When she finished the last of the slides and Jared had closed with a Why Stone Industries recap, they wrapped the presentation. David looked at his son. What do you think? I like it, Alexander said, nodding. I think the direct-to-consumer ideas are the strongest. They fit with our strategy and our target markets. But I'm skeptical that they can be rolled out on a large scale. And, he added, dropping a file folder on the table in front of Jared, I am worried from this latest consumer research that you've alienated the target female consumer with your manifesto. You've dropped 10 points in intent to buy with females since it happened. Jared eyed the file in disbelief. They'll be back up by next week. This is a flash in the pan, and you know it, he thought. Perhaps. Gagnon lifted a brow. But the fact remains, the female demographic is our most important to capture right now. We can't afford to partner with a company that's alienated the market segment. It won't last, Jared repeated on a low growl. Likely not, Alexander agreed. Your ideas are creative and sound, but I'm afraid I'm going to need market research to buy into them. So we're not all having a little enthusiasm party here that isn't based on reality. Jared folded his hands in front of him, struggling to control his anger. That will take time. He had a board meeting in 2 weeks that he needed this deal signed, sealed, and delivered for if he wanted to maintain control of his company. Alexander shrugged. We'd like you to repitch next week in Paris. He lifted a brow. You're a busy man. If you have other engagements, send Bailey back to Paris with me. I can weigh in with what I know works, and we can chew away at it. Bailey turned gray. Jared's blood heated to a dangerous level. So this was Alexander's game? Taking care of unfinished business with Bailey? Whatever that was? He looked at David, but the Frenchman's expression was one of deference to his son. And Jared had nothing to work with but a botched attempt at humor instigated by a slightly wounded heart and a massive complication between his CMO and Maison's soon-to-be CEO. He gathered the papers in front of him together with a viciously efficient movement, refusing to let the fury simmering in his veins find an outlet. That's very kind of you, he said. But I have a friend with a villa on the outskirts of Nice. Bailey and I will regroup there, flesh the ideas out, and will present in Paris. I should add, David interjected, that Alexander has indicated he'd like to hear from Gehrig Electronics as well. Jared felt the earth tilt beneath his feet. You're adding another company to the mix? David nodded. We feel we need to do due diligence, given some product launches we've been made aware of. Due diligence. Jared felt the fumes rise off him. Gehrig hadn't been a factor until Alexander Gagnon arrived on the scene. His gaze flickered to David's son, sitting with his elbow on the table, jaw resting in his palm as he watched Jared with the intense interest of a hawk studying its prey. David had been right. His son liked to win. Except this had nothing to do with business and everything to do with Bailey. Frustration clawed at him like a knife. He needed to be back in the States massaging an antsy board. But unless he wanted to muddy the waters, with everything he didn't know, make accusations he wasn't sure of, he had no choice but to play along. He forced what he was sure was a poor representation of a smile to his lips and stood up. "We totally understand. No problem, gentlemen. Let the best candidate win." They answered a few more questions from the marketing team and made arrangements to pitch in Paris the week after. Then he and Bailey left to pack. She stopped him outside their rooms, her hand on his arm, her face devoid of color. "I'm so sorry, Jared. This is my fault. I should have taken myself out of the deal." He lifted his head. "You heard his reasons. He thinks I've alienated the female demographic." "Yes, but—" She hesitated, worrying her lip between her teeth. "He's playing games, yes," he growled. "We will talk more in Nice. Much more, Bailey. But if he wants to make this personal, let him. I don't intend to lose." And that is the end of Chapter 5. I will be back with Chapter 6 in 4 days. Come back and join me to find out what happens next. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye for now.